All right, so welcome everyone. It's time for National Journal Club, sponsored by the ACMT. Welcome. This is going to be a great session today, brought to you by Regions Hospital Fellowship Program in Minnesota. I hope they got more snow than we did in Chicago today, but I hope their travel was better than mine. Today, just a couple of announcements. Remember, if you're out there in the Twitter sphere, use the hashtag ACMTNJC so that we can follow the conversation. Also, in the spirit of really getting a lot of participation, don't forget to raise your hand, and we will, we'd love to hear your comments. Today, we are very fortunate to have the Minnesota group, and we will have Amelia Burgess, Abby Montague, Ben Willebrand, and Sam Stelflug, their fearless leader, leading us through a naloxone talk. And I know people may have some opinions, so we want to hear them. So why don't you folks take it away?
Hi, this is Amelia. Welcome. Now I'm trying to click forward. It was working. Oh, we went too far. No. Oh, the question is first. I'm sorry, you reversed that.
All right, right. So let's start with audience response. So just to set this whole thing up here, we'll start with question number one. So when, in 2017 here, we are recognizing lots of heroin overdoses and folks with opioid toxidrome. When reversing this opioid toxidrome today in 2017, do you find that you're needing high-dose naloxone? So we're just curious what you guys are finding out there. Is it never, sometimes, or always? All right, well that looks pretty good response there. Let's close it out in 2 seconds for those of you that haven't gotten to it. All right, Tara, I'm not sure if that's visible, but for those of you that may not be able to see it, so 2 out of 11 say never, 8 out of 11 say sometimes, 1 out of 11 say always, and we're interested maybe to hear who that is. But yeah, I think I'm in the sometimes category also. All right, well, why don't we jump into the first article?
All right, thank you very much. This is Amelia. I'm a first-year fellow at Regions in St. Paul and at Hennepin County. We're going to start our discussion today with a Schumann, Erickson, Thompson, Zautke, and Denton's 2008 paper from ClinTalks, Fentanyl Epidemic in Chicago, Illinois, and surrounding Cook County. It seems that the authors became curious in August 2005 when they treated 6 opioid overdoses in one shift in their ED. Other notable observations about the night were that several of the patients required large doses of naloxone, and after resuscitation, the patients reported that they had received free samples of heroin, notably in pink and orange baggies from a dealer. The clinicians also learned from paramedics and law enforcement that many people had been found unresponsive in a building nearby, and the Chicago Tribune reported that there had been many illnesses due to free heroin. At the multi-victim site, the state crime lab found fentanyl in residues. Several months later, in the spring of 2006, the clinicians noted another uptick in overdoses in their ED, along with media reports of deaths in the community due to fentanyl. So this paper was their attempt to describe the outbreak. The investigators performed a 21-month retrospective review with 2 components, a review of the ED charts at the University of Chicago, University of Illinois at Chicago Department of Emergency Medicine, and a review of the fentanyl fatality database at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. They looked at records from April 1st, 2005 through December 31st, 2006. For the ED chart review, they identified encounters with ICD-9 codes for cardiac arrest, respiratory abnormalities, opium and opiate poisoning, and heroin poisoning. They included for study charts with documented heroin use, abuse, or overdose, and they recorded demographics, transportation to the ED, naloxone dose and route, urine drug screen, disposition, and outcome. Then they did a separate analysis for frequent flyers. for the review of fentanyl fatalities, they included cases involving illicit fentanyl and excluded cases involving prescription fentanyl. The analysis covered the same dates. They collected demographics, date of death, whole blood fentanyl concentrations, presence of other opiates, cocaine, and alcohol. The whole blood fentanyl concentrations were derived through ELISA screening with GC mass spec confirmation and quantification. Of note, fentanyl wasn't routinely tested until December 2005, 9 months into the study period. I think it makes sense to look at the medical examiner data first. During the 21-month study period, the medical examiner recorded 342 deaths related to fentanyl. 84% were men. They ranged in age from 17 to 68 with a mean of 40 years. The mean fentanyl level was 22.7 with a broad range from less than 1 to 164, from less than 1 to 164 nanograms per milliliter. In 62% of cases, they found multiple substances. Therefore, in 38% of cases, only fentanyl was identified. In the multiple substance cases, opiates, cocaine, and alcohol were all identified. The ED chart review identified 55 patient encounters ranging in age from 20 to 62 years with a mean of 43 years. 86% were men. The demographics look the same as in the ME data. 80% of the patients were discharged from the hospital, about 4% left AMA, and around 13% were admitted. 2 patients presented in cardiac arrest and died. 84% were transported to the hospital by EMS. 80% received naloxone prior to arrival, and among these, the pre-hospital dosing ranged from 0.4 to 4 milligrams with a mean of 1.53 milligrams. In 26 visits, 47% of the encounters, patients received naloxone in the ED. Among these, the dose ranged from 0.4 milligrams to 12 milligrams with a mean of 3.36. It isn't entirely clear how many patients required high dose of naloxone. In the results, it states that 1 patient required 12, 1 required 8, and 1 required 6, but in the discussion it states that 6 required 6 or more. So I'm going with 6 required 6 or more. However, only 4 of the patients, representing 15% of the encounters, were resuscitated with no more than 0.4 milligrams. 19 encounters, or a third of the visits, represented 7 frequent flyer patients. These patients were less likely to get naloxone from EMS or in the ED, and none of them required more than 6 milligrams. This is just a little editorializing, but it seems that this gang of 7 was perhaps a little bit more nuanced in their heroin use, and they were more willing to seek help early. This figure from the paper shows the number of ED visits for opioid overdose over time. We can clearly see the spikes in August and in May that triggered the study. This figure represents the medical examiner data. It starts in August, not in April, so I assume this means that the medical examiner didn't identify any fentanyl-related deaths during the first 4 months of the study period. Routine testing began in December '05, so it is possible that there were deaths missed before that time. When we look at these figures side by side, we can see the outbreak pretty nicely, recognizing that the University of Illinois ED is only one place in Cook County that overdoses might be taken for treatment, and that drugs can move through neighborhoods. So on the left, we have human behavior in that catchment area, and on the right, we have the final common pathway for the county. And you can see the area under the curve on the right is pretty ugly. So that's representing the deaths. That's the medical examiner data. Of note, the ED visit shows an earlier downturn than the death data. This may be because they actually ran out of naloxone in May, and they had to divert patients to other hospitals. So I found the discussion in this paper very fascinating. The dealers really know their market. Even when they name their drug, this will kill you, they nonetheless get people to buy and use their product. The authors noted several problems in the community's response to this outbreak. First, the hospital ran out of naloxone at one point and had to divert patients. While there was an 800% increase in calls to EMS for overdose during the time period, and while the police were forming a task force, the clinicians were not directly informed or involved in the ED. Meanwhile, epidemics were going on in other cities. The authors of this paper contacted the Chicago Health Alert Network in the fall of 2005, but the alert did not go out until the spring of 2006, so there was a delay in making clinicians aware that this was going on. However, Chicago responded to the epidemic through law enforcement initiatives and community initiatives to increase naloxone availability. Eventually, they did shut down a lab in Mexico, and they also shut down the gang in Chicago that was selling the drug, and that ended the outbreak. Throughout this, the Chicago Tribune was reporting on the epidemic. I don't know if you can see that. I can't see it much better. And making the location of the drug known to the public and potentially new consumers. So there was some thought that people were actually going, seeking this out. I've circled the name of the housing project in red. I actually stayed at a hotel a block from there last weekend, and it looked really nice.
It's perfect.
So the paper demonstrates really nicely what we experience every day, providing patient care with incomplete information. I really appreciated the description of the outbreak as it unfolded and then at least temporarily resolved. The challenges identified by the author still remain challenges to us. The drug markets move and change, and the media can be a double-edged sword. Those of us on the front line may not receive the data in a timely fashion. The naloxone shortage itself makes me think that naloxone use could be used as an indicator for ongoing surveillance of opioid activity in the community, and certainly with the extension of medical records, of electronic medical records right now, we should be able to follow just by the naloxone use alone. As with all studies, this one has some limitations. The ED charts couldn't identify fentanyl in their patients. The county didn't routinely test for fentanyl until December 2005. The authors don't report if there's any standard protocol or starting dosage for naloxone use, so we don't really know if, if EMS was following the same indications for giving naloxone as the ED doctors, et cetera, and between clinicians, just one person starts at 2 and the other person starts at 0.4. We don't know from the article. I would have liked to see a visual representation of the naloxone dosing, or have a median and mode reported, and likewise of the fentanyl level. So, because there's sort of a broad range, and those outliers really could pull the mean higher. So with a range of 1 to 164, a mean of 23 doesn't tell me a lot about where the fentanyl was overall in the medical examiner data. So thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you, Steve.
All right, well, that was a great discussion, and this paper is near and dear to my heart because these are my good friends and colleagues, part of Toxicon. And for those of you that don't know our setup, we, the Toxicon Consortium here in the Westside Medical District, there we have 4 major hospitals within blocks of each other here: Cook County, UIC, in fact, I'm looking at it from my office right now. Rush is also across the street, and the VA. So it just gives you an idea of, this was just the cases at UIC. I mean, it was an explosion. We are fortunate to have on the line at least one of the authors. Trevon Thompson, if you're there, please raise your hand. I see my buddy Tim Toxboy Erickson. Are you there, Tim?
Oh, yes, Steve, I am. I'm looking out my window at a nor'easter here in Boston, but in my mind's eye, I can see Cook County Hospital and UIC, and definitely remember the epidemic. And by the way, an excellent review of the article. Actually, your review was better than it was written.
Although I would say the terms drop dead, flatline, and reaper, those were probably your words. Am I not correct?
I do have a black T-shirt with those nicknames on it, yes.
Yeah, I thought so. So, yeah, what else can you share with everyone about your memory of the whole disaster when it hit?
Well, I'll say a few things, and I don't want to steal any thunder from my dear colleague Trevon Thompson if he's on. He's much more articulate than I am. But the epidemic was definitely a real deal, and want to really give a lot of kudos to Heather Schumann, the first author on this paper. She did a lot of heavy lifting on this as far as gathering data, and along with the medical examiner's office. They did a tremendous job. But a lot of these overdoses were actually from the suburbs, so they were coming in to the inner city to get this. At the time was a new cutting-edge drug where you were really riding the line. It was the most powerful stuff out there, and we found that in the Robert Taylor homes which is an area that's been gentrified a bit around Mercy Hospital, where Steve Axe worked many years. Many of the suburbia kids would come in to this area in Chicago, purchase it, take one hit, and the next thing they knew, they were waking up in an ED, and tragically, as you can see from the data, there were many, many deaths from this, and they didn't even recall their euphoria. So that was one thing, that this wasn't just inner city hardcore. There was a lot of suburbia cases. The naloxone dose is a really good discussion from the presentation. It did vary, and back then, people weren't necessarily going with a lower dose that we are now with, 0.04 or the 0.4. Back then, the adage was if you saw an opioid overdose, a lot of people were starting with 2 milligrams, so that may account for some of the higher doses, and I know some people were going up to 10 and 12, which created a bit of a problem because we did have to go on naloxone bypass, and as Steve pointed out, that area in the west side of Chicago, it's not just UIC. Right across the street is Cook County. There's the VA hospital. There's Rush. It's a large medical district. So fortunately, even though we ran out of naloxone, our partners across the street had plenty, and patients could readily be transferred if need be. But again, Mercy Hospital took a large brunt of this because they were so close to the projects. And back in 05, 06, there wasn't much in the way of medical record sharing. Now all those aforementioned institutions use the electronic medical record Cerner. So I think nowadays we'd have a better idea of presentations, doses of naloxone, morbidity and mortality. So those are the things that just come off the top of my head. There was great work done by the Chicago Police Department to shut down this particular gang. A lot of this was coming right from Mexico City, and as you probably know, there's a large contingency from Mexico in Chicago, so it made sense that this would be a hotbed. And recently, a couple of years ago, we had yet another fentanyl outbreak with and don't quote me on this, I think there was somewhat close to 51 deaths over a week's time, or a couple of weeks' time, particularly on the south and west side. So this hasn't gone away, and this was kind of a sentinel epidemic, but tragically, and I know that's true now in the state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, most of the opioid-related deaths are fentanyl linked, where they are screening for that. So that's my recounts, and thanks for the opportunity to share a distant but very profound memory. I mean, when these patients came in, it really was a tidal wave of opioid overdoses in a way we'd never seen before prior.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. It really was, from my perspective across the street, it was just stunning, the numbers of cases. And normally, ER docs don't call the poison center for heroin or opioid overdoses because they know how to handle it, but we really over time got a lot of calls. I'd say one of the best lessons that I remember from this is the agencies started communicating better. Chicago Fire, Public Health, Poison Center, hospitals, and the medical examiner. And now it was October of 2015, we got our more recent spike, which has only continued to go up. And all the agencies are at least working well and communicating better. It's really just unbelievable. Tim, so in Boston, you're seeing similar, a lot of fentanyl right now?
Oh, yeah, a lot. And we recently had the Director of Public Health come in and give a presentation on opioid epidemics, and it's in not just in the Boston area, but even more profoundly in the smaller communities in Massachusetts. And the predominant cause of death when the screen is done and autopsy levels done is fentanyl related. And as you know, at first I was wondering, why would someone who's pushing and selling these stuff use fentanyl? It's got to be harder to get a hold of, more expensive, but it actually is quite easy to get a hold of, again, through the connections they had in Mexico. And you may have seen a recent New England Journal of Medicine article by Frank and Pollock et al. That talked about the wholesale price of these, that heroin costs are about $65,000 per kilo wholesale, where this illicit fentanyl is available for $3,500 per kilo. So a dramatic savings cost by these people cutting any heroin with fentanyl, because they don't have to use that much, and obviously highly addictive, and once you have a customer for life. But in a poor marketing plan, a lot of these patients and victims don't survive long enough to really kick back the funds and the profits to the dealers. So it's all about supply, demand, and cost. But right now you can see why they're cutting this. It's accessible and it's cheaper.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. And are you guys in Minnesota, are you guys seeing a similar picture? I imagine so.
It's not just heroin. I mean, we're seeing just a lot of fentanyl with our medical examiners. A lot of the deaths are then being attributed to fentanyl or just unknown, but everything screams opioid. So it's been a tough kind of climate too.
Great. Okay. So I don't see Trevon, your name on the line. If you are out there, just raise your hand. And if anyone does want to make a comment, just raise your hand and we'll get you on the line. But why don't we just keep moving? I think we could have talked about this article for the full hour. And Phoenix wrote in with a real good question. They asked, well, what actually is high dose? And I think maybe we can get back to that. But here, what is your standard dose of naloxone in the ED for an overdose with no history? Maybe this will give us a sense of that. Less than 0.05, 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 1 or 2. And again, I think this is really the starting point. Where are folks starting these days?
Steve, this is Tim. The choice of 1 pound is not available. Is there a reason for that?
So that's usually the quantity that, that gets called in under your name for morphine. Is that right, at a pharmacy?
Only in Northwest Indiana, my friend.
All right, we have 10 responses. Any more?
That's it, Steve. I've closed it.
All right, great. So, I'm not sure if these are displayed or not, but this is fascinating. So, of our group on the line here, 2 out of 10 say less than 0.05 milligrams as starting dose. 1 is 0.1. 2 are 0.2, and we have 5 starting at 0.4. So that's just fascinating. All right, why don't we jump into the next article here?
All right. Well, I'm Abby Montague, and I'm reviewing the article titled "The Evolution of Recommended Naloxone Dosing for Opioid Overdose by Medical Specialty." This is by Dr. Connors and Dr. Nelson, and it was published in JMT last year and covered in the JMT podcast actually in December, and previously published as a poster at ACMT in Phoenix. In the introduction, they discussed the history of naloxone. It was introduced in 1967 for reversal of opioid-induced respiratory depression. The initial dosing used was determined via animal studies and experience using it in the operating room. They review the adverse effects that have been associated with naloxone administration, including catecholamine excess, pulmonary edema, agitation, precipitated withdrawal, and the risk of elopement. And then the last 2 paragraphs, they comment that the research on the safety and efficacy outside the OR is limited, but further research is unlikely to occur since use is so common. Their stated objective was to compare the naloxone dose recommendation by authors of commonly available references to determine trends in dosing and variation across specialties. To do this, they reviewed a sample of different resources, such as textbooks, study guides, and internet-based resources that a clinician might use to quickly provide patient care. They looked at resources across multiple specialties, so they included UpToDate and Medscape from general medicine, the EM blog Life in the Fast Lane, medical toxicology texts such as Goldfrank's and Olson's. They used Harrison's from internal medicine and pediatric Harriet Lane handbook, and then a pain medicine resource and anesthesia texts, for examples. They included sources that had to specify IV dosing and be published or updated within the last 10 years. They then recorded the dosing recommendation for healthcare setting in each reference and another regimen if it was specified for opioid-tolerant patients. The data was analyzed with descriptive statistics with percentages and ranges, and then the authors compared the data publication with the starting dose with a coefficient of determination. The authors had 25 resources that listed IV naloxone dosing. In their discussion of the results, they reported that 48%, or 12 out of the 25, recommended an initial starting dose of 0.5 milligrams or less, that 16%, or 4 out of the 25, recommended 0.1 milligrams as a starting dose, and the remaining 9, or 36%, recommended 0.4 or 0.5 milligrams. They did note that the majority of medical toxicology and general medicine resources, along with half of anesthesia and emergency medicine resources, tended to recommend the less than 0.05 milligram dosing to start and at the start of their range, and then that all internet-based resources recommended initial dose starting at less than or equal to 0.1 milligrams. There were 4 resources that documented or that were referenced different dosing for opioid-tolerant patients. And then they noticed that there was a small trend towards newer resources recommending lower dose than the older ones with an R-squared of negative 0.21. The maximum dose had a wide range from 0.2 to 20 milligrams. And so in our next slide, what I did is take figure 1 from the article. That's a graphical representation of the naloxone dose recommendations. The general recommendations are the black rectangles with ranges depicted by the longer bars. The specific recommendations for opioid-dependent patients are depicted in gray. The max doses are the empty white rectangles on the right. And the medical specialty for each literature source was listed in Table 1 and are labeled on the left of this slide. As you can see, there was no clear consensus within or across the medical specialties, but when I read the description of the results, I was at first surprised that they said 48% had recommended less than 0.5, since graphically my eye was drawn to the 0.4 line, which I depicted here in green. But it's only 9 of the 25 resources that recommend 0.4 as a starting dose without qualification, and 4 more that just recommend it for opioid naive, but have a lower starting dose for the opioid tolerant patient. There's a lot more variation between the lower range opioid doses, so between 0.02, 0.04, and 0.05, so I think there's less stark of a contrast there, but you can see the difference in recommendations across specialties here. So they did comment that most dose recommendations were lower than what is commonly used as the 0.4 milligrams, and they discussed that 4 of the starting doses are lower for opioid-tolerant patients and that population is also increasing, which might explain the trend with the negative R-squared towards decreasing naloxone doses for almost all patients. The opioid tolerance wasn't defined in the references, and that the suspicion and definition of opioid tolerance kind of varies in clinical practice settings. They also discussed that the cited references are summary sources. They're written by an expert, so it's expert opinion, not experimental evidence, but it does reflect what clinicians might reach for as a first-line resource. There is also a tenfold difference in initial dose recommendations with an increased risk of ordering and administration error. I know that I am frequently trying to clarify decimal points and zeros when I'm trying to figure out what dose of naloxone someone received or should receive. There is a need for patient-centered prospective data that is unlikely to occur with the familiarity everyone has for this drug. In the limitations, they discussed that the references were limited to that which is available to the authors by their institutional access. They did discuss that the level of quality for each resource is limited to expert opinion, and that since they were only looking at IV dosing, you don't have the captured IM dosing as well that can be used in similar situations. Their conclusion was that the variation in dosing recommendations still exists, that MedTox and general medicine resources tend to recommend smaller doses than 0.4, and that these should be examined more fully in other studies. They also recommended that, discussed that the starting dose has decreased with subsequent publications. When we read the article, our discussion and conclusions were really similar to the authors. We thought it was very helpful to recognize the difference among the resources and specialties, since as we're talking to clinicians from other practice settings, it may be hard to encourage people to start with lower doses if their trusted go-to resource is tenfold different. It does seem like a tailored approach is best, that starting with low doses and escalating according to the acuity of the situation, the stability of the airway and breathing support, the known potency or duration of effective opioids if you know it, and the known opioid tolerance if they can come into place. There's a lot of factors that we all weigh quite quickly when we're trying to decide on initial naloxone dosing. There was a response in JMT published in December by Lombardi and some clinicians in Canada from Quebec, starting the conversation, and the authors also had a reply that talked about the dose of 0.4 versus a lower dose approach. And so it's a really interesting conversation that we enjoyed reading, enjoyed having within our group, and we wanted to invite commentary from the other fellowships to see what kind of naloxone dosing everyone else uses.
All right, that was a great review. So yeah, please, if you'd like to weigh in, raise your hand. And thanks so much to Nick Connors, the lead author on this, for joining us. Nick, are you there? Nick, I've unmuted you, so if you can you hear us? All right, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Maybe I had it muted.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah,
hey,
welcome. Good. Any comments on the paper?
Well, you know, one of the things we were just trying to do was just see, you know, what's out there, what's being taught, and what's being recommended. And, you know, just looking at some of the recommendations, it just seemed crazy to us that, you know, the range of dosing goes from, you know, when you look at the initials as low as 0.04, I guess 0.02 in the pain medicine resource, all the way up to masses of 20 milligrams. Like, there's no other medication that has that variation in dosing. Imagine giving, like, magnitude differences in antibiotic dosing or something like that. And, you know, the other thing that kind of factored into this is I know I've dealt with a lot of precipitated opioid withdrawal in the ER. I'm sure, you know, a lot of the other folks have too, and that's really disruptive. It can be harmful, it's often not, but, you know, we had heard of places that before they give their naloxone dose, put the physical restraints on folks, hit them with a big dose, and then they're breathing again, but now you have an agitated patient tied to the bed, you know, using up lots of resources, and, you know, potentially causing a danger to themselves or other folks in the ED. So that's kind of what motivated us to take a look at this, and the results were really interesting, just kind of all over the place. We kind of focused on the initial dosing just as a place to start, with the thought that, you know, with someone at the bedside, you can give more doses, and as long as you're able to ventilate that patient with, you know, bag valve mask, you've got some time, so you can build on that. And saw, you know, pretty significant variability.
Great. No, that makes a lot of sense. When you mentioned that really abrupt initiation of withdrawal, what sort of dose range were you seeing that in, Nick?
I think when I was in New York City, the EMS folks there would give what almost seemed like punitive doses of naloxone for a lot of the methadone folks we had there. So I remember being, you know, working clinical shift, you know, trying to sedate folks who had been given 2 milligrams IV, you know, right off the street. And that was a difficult patient, because now you're dealing with, you know, the moving target of the naloxone kind of wearing off. Where is the methadone? What am I giving them to kind of sedate them? And it's just a total mess. But that was kind of the one that stands out in my mind. But, you know, it's it's the bigger doses. I'm not sure I ever saw much of it with the 0.4 dosing, but it also changes, you know, whether EMS was able to get an IV or whether this was IM. And there's even more variability now with, you know, multiple types of first responders being able to give it by multiple routes. We just don't have, you know, really solid pharmacokinetic data on that stuff.
Great. No, that's really fascinating, the context. I know that I did have one experience giving 0.4 to a patient I did not realize was taking both street heroin and methadone and precipitated some nasty withdrawal. I lost nursing support significantly for a good week or two after. Yeah, I'm just curious, other folks out there, what kind of doses do you start with? Minnesota, since you're on the line, you know, what is your standard approach?
This is Sam, Steve. So we advocate 0.4 or even a little bit less, 0.1. Sometimes it comes down to what the nurse is comfortable diluting in whatever limited time you have. And part of the reason is to not precipitate withdrawal, but the other big reason is just for an ED disposition and flow standpoint. What we kind of advocate here is, if you think about Narcan as about an hour half-life, give or take, if a 0.05 milligram dose would be effective in whatever scenario you're working with, if you give 2 or 4, the whole observation period, and I know we'll discuss that maybe ad nauseum in the last paper here, but if you give 4 milligrams, you're now waiting an hour to get to 2, another hour to get to 1, to 0.5, to 0.25, to 0.125. You're like 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 half-lives out before you would be down to what would have been an effective dose in the first place. So the whole, especially in the era of extended acting things, you basically, in my mind, if you have an unknown opioid and you give 2 or 4 milligrams, you're admitting that patient, unless you're in a scenario where you're boarding patients in the ED for 8, 12, 16 hours. So just from an ED flow standpoint, starting low makes sense. And I mean, like was said before, if you're in a scenario where you can very closely observe the patient, there's no downside if they're not dead or almost dead to giving a really low dose and then just giving another one if it doesn't work.
Right. No, that's a great perspective also. It's true, like personally I like to titrate to the point where the patient is breathing and keep them in a resuscitation bay where you can just watch them slowly wake up. I mean, you know, then you're not getting to doing the dance about how long you're watching them. All right. And, you know, again, you know, if anyone wants to weigh in, please raise your hand. I realize that we're clicking through this hour pretty quickly, and we've got, you know, one more really great paper to look at. But, yeah, no, I really appreciated this paper to see the state of where we are in terms of the wide range and perspective in dosing. Okay, and thanks again, Nick, for...
Steve, this is Tim in Boston. Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything said, and I used to give a lot more naloxone initially than I do now, and I like to go low, as they say, to B&B, breathing and belligerence, that wonderful balance. But there are 2 scenarios I've seen where people now have gone with such a low dose that they need to hurry up a little more. One is in children who clearly, if they're getting into it accidentally, are usually opioid naive and not addicted with a high tolerance. So that's one time when you don't have to start so low. And if you're not sure, giving a child 2 milligrams is not going to precipitate withdrawal. And the other is when they come in blue and apneic and have really no recordable vitals. I've seen people giving, you know, 0.04 or 0.4, and at that point, I really do think a bigger dose is mandatory because it's life-saving. You can deal with the withdrawal afterwards. So that's the 2 scenarios where I've seen the sway of this very low dose maybe being a time where you want to up it a little bit more, even though you have to deal with some of the consequences afterwards. You'd rather deal with that than the M&M on a conference with your peers.
Yeah, great. No, thanks. Actually, those are 2 important case scenarios. You want not dead, obviously, and it is interesting telling the pediatricians, you know, just give them 2. They're opioid naive. You'll just reverse it quickly. That's your goal. All right, excellent. Well, all right. In the interest of getting through the last paper, let's go for it. We've got 2 more audience response questions that we'll do here. The first one here is 5 to 10 years ago, in the Wayback Machine, how long did you observe a patient routinely after a heroin OD that required reversal with naloxone? So we're looking for your practice 5 to 10 years ago. And the answers are rolling in. All right. See buzzers stop pretty much. Okay, so that's interesting. So back in that period of time, we had 1 person was watching for 1 hour, 3 out of 10 were watching 2 hours, and 6 out of 10, we actually have a majority, were looking at folks for 4 hours. And then to advance to the next question, today, 2017, how long do you routinely observe a patient after a heroin overdose that required reversal with naloxone? What is your practice now? All right, and this is super interesting. So we have 1 out of 11, 1 hour, 1 out of 11, 2 hours, 7 out of 11, 4 hours, and we have 2 out of 11 that are now watching for more than 4 hours. All right, so with that, why don't we hit the last paper?
All right, hello everybody. This is Ben Willenbring. I'm a first-year Tox Fellow. The title of the last article is, do heroin overdose patients require observation after receiving naloxone? Hold on, let me advance the slide. The authors are Michael Willman, David Liss, Evan Schwartz, and Michael Mullins from Washington University in St. Louis, published in Clintox 2016. So this article was basically a literature review looking to answer 3 related questions. Firstly, what are the medical risks to a heroin user who refuses ambulance transport after naloxone? Secondly, if the heroin user is treated in the ED with naloxone, how long must they be observed prior to discharge? And last, how effective in heroin users is naloxone administered by first responders and bystanders? And are the risks associated with naloxone distribution, and what are the risks associated with naloxone distribution programs? So the authors sought to answer the questions by reviewing relevant articles. They found the articles using PubMed and Google Scholar searches, and they had an unblinded author kind of evaluating whether or not they were relevant. They found 8 articles relevant to the first question, 5 to the second, and 15 to the third. So on the assessing medical risks to a heroin user refusing transport after naloxone, they found 2 prospective studies from Oslo and 6 retrospective studies kind of scattered in the US and Scandinavia. In all of these put together, they had 5,443 patients, and they only found 4 attributable deaths to repeat opioid intoxication. So they calculated a number needed to treat of 1,361. There were significant limitations to the studies, and obviously, you know, they were all done kind of differently. But they almost all exclusively relied on medical examiner follow-up data to figure out if these patients died. And the level of you know, sort of reasonably well confirmed follow-up was, by my calculation, pretty low. So in the prospective studies, I guess in Oslo, you need their Social Security number to follow up with medical examiners. So a lot of these patients did not have actual follow-up. So my calculation was like at most 26%. And then in the retrospective studies, again, it relied on medical examiner data and looking for deaths, and you can miss deaths if you just poll the wrong medical examiner, if they went somewhere else to die, or you got a wrong identity or something like that. On assessing observation time after naloxone treatment in the ED, there were 5 studies. 2 of those were basically, opinion articles. And then there were 2 retrospective reviews of ED opioid overdose patients with a total of 107 presumed heroin overdose patients and 84 mixed opioid, so that being some were heroin, some were oxycodone, et cetera. And together they found a low incidence of recurrent clinically significant toxicity. And then there was a prospective study in Canada with 573 patients receiving naloxone in the ED and evaluated their clinical appearance 1 hour after receiving naloxone. And then they used this data to propose a clinical prediction rule for discharging these patients. And what they proposed was if the patient has a GCS of 15, normal vital signs, and they're able to mobilize normally 1 hour after naloxone, that they can be safely discharged. What they didn't really go into was, how much total naloxone did they get by what route. They did, in this study, this prospective Canada study, they started the study when their sort of standard was 0.4 IV, and then as they started ramping up the study, it switched to 0.8 sub-Q. But again, there's not good data on how much naloxone did the average patient get, et cetera. All in all, these studies had limitations from lack of confirmation of the identity of the opioid. So most of them, we don't really know what was doing it and what combinations they were suffering from. And then finally, looking at efficacy of the first responder and bystander naloxone administration, they found 15 articles. Summary is that, so a lot of these offered some primary data, and they've largely found very high survival after bystander administered naloxone, that trained and untrained naloxone administration was equally effective, and around a third of opioid users report contemplating using higher doses of opioid, knowing that there's easily available naloxone. And they also found that there's around a 1% mortality associated with bystander naloxone use. And additionally, there was an NNT calculated of 227 take-home naloxone kits to save 1 life. Overall, the data seems to be relatively convincing of these conclusions, and of the 3 kind of sections of this paper, this is probably the least controversial. The authors conclude that the risk of death with short-acting opioid overdose after naloxone is small, that heroin users who respond to naloxone who have normal mentation and normal vital signs may safely refuse transport, and that 1 hour of ED observation after naloxone administration with normal respiratory rate and mentation can be safely discharged. Naloxone administered by first responders and bystanders is safe, and that opioid overdose prevention programs are safe, cost-effective, and beneficial. So there are significant limitations to a lot of these studies. Probably the biggest one is just confirmed follow-up on a lot of these, transport refusal patients. And although they calculate a number needed to treat of 1,361, if, just a handful of deaths are missed, it really drastically changes that number. There's also just sort of an overall assumption that what we're dealing with largely is actual heroin and very little real confirmation of that. Additionally, the outcome for a lot of this data really is just death and very little consideration for non-fatal serious morbidity, which is obviously a pretty strong possibility. There's no mention of the ongoing fentanyl epidemic, so this was published in 2016, which is, we were fully into our nationwide fentanyl epidemic at that point. There's really not any talk on whether or not this data is applicable to the current climate that we have. And a lot of the ED observation studies are pretty old. They're from 1990 to 2000, and prior to a lot of the fentanyl prevalence on the street. And just to put this in perspective, this is from the National Forensic Lab Information System from the DEA, just looking at fentanyl prevalence in testing samples in the last 15 years, the fentanyl being the tan triangle line. So there was obviously an epidemic in 2006, but appears to be not on the same order of magnitude as what we're currently seeing. So just some kind of questions that I thought of based on these papers. Is it safe to transport naloxone-reversed opioid intoxicated patients, or to not transport? Are we concerned about non-fatal significant morbidity? Is 1 hour ED observation time enough after naloxone? And then, you know, this prospective candidate study, a lot of them I think use sub-Q, so is the sub-Q pharmacokinetics similar enough to use, to apply to what we probably most of us use as IV? And is it safe to assume the identity of a street drug based on what they call it or what they think it is? And is this data applicable to the current environment? So I'll open it up to discussion.
All right, that's a great review of that. And yeah, we're fortunate to have an author from each of the papers today. Mike Mullins is joining us from St. Louis. So Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thanks so much for joining. And I mean, personally, I think you guys are asking 3 of the most pressing questions on opioids and naloxone that we're all facing now. Did you want to tackle some of the questions that they posed in their review?
Well, I think what we tackled was what used to be the 3 most pressing questions. I think the final slide is now the set of current pressing questions that we need more data to evaluate. So we had some letters written and some comments about the review, and you know, the question for each clinician is, does this apply to the patient population you see and the drug abuse climate in your metropolitan area? So the data are what they are. I think the Scandinavian data are pretty robust because of a universal healthcare system. Everybody has a national identity card in Denmark. You know, it's unlikely somebody left Copenhagen unless they crossed the bridge over to Malmo to go die and take it after the second overdose, something like that. So San Antonio, it's unlikely that you would leave Bexar County and go to New Braunfels or San Angelo, you know, and then die. So I think that's fairly as robust as U.S. data are going to get. They're not nearly as good as I think the European data for reasons that I think are obvious about the healthcare systems. So I mean, this is consistent with my practice, though. I mean, when I'm working and I see somebody in the ED and they receive a single dose of what is at least presumed to be heroin, because we don't have analytic confirmation in real time, and we're having trouble getting analytic confirmation after the fact, you know, in our setting. But again, I live in the only state without a prescription drug monitoring program, so there you go. So I'm just operating, you know, clinically, making a clinical decision. So if I have somebody who receives a single dose of naloxone after a presumed heroin overdose, and they remain sitting upright, and we have a kind of row of chairs in an observed area. If they're sitting upright and they don't require additional naloxone, they're grumpy as is typically the case, but I talk to them and give them a turkey sandwich and tell them, look, if things are okay in an hour, then we can talk about letting you go. And I've not had those patients bounce back, you know, on my shift or the next shift, or get an email from my director later on saying, remember this patient you saw the other day.
Great, great. Yeah, and you know, it's amazing to me how that turkey sandwich never makes it into the textbooks, but yeah, key clinical maneuver. You know, one question that I really have is, it's just a disconnect between the EMS literature and the emergency medicine literature. Because, you know, I've watched as those papers from EMS literature came out, really with absolute fascination. And you know, they were accepting refusals in the field. Do you think that it's just, we're looking at a different population? These are folks with like quick and easy, uncomplicated reversals. And what we get confused with in the emergency department are polydrug overdoses or not straightforward overdoses. I guess I find, you know, just worrying about that. What do you think of that, Mike?
Well, I guess it's hard to tell whether the EMS refusal population is that much different from the EMS dragged in population, you know, on their polysubstance use or not. But you know, the EMS, the fear stated by our EMS colleagues is, oh, we give them a reversal agent and say, now I don't want to go to the hospital, and then we're going to get called to the same scene or a block away, you know, an hour from now, and the guy's going to be dead or something like that. But in fact, it doesn't seem to be happening, and our EMS system has adapted this and said, yeah, if they refuse, we'll let them refuse, and we're not seeing medical examiner cases that match up with somebody who's previously seen. Although those are hard to catch in our system if we don't have a universal ID program, and somebody who gets awakened in an alley with naloxone may not produce their identity willingly. So I would say we don't have quite as reliable data as say Copenhagen or Helsinki or Oslo would have had, but I would say I think our EMS crews are still using 2 milligrams as their just slam them hard with naloxone and get it over with. They don't want to sit there and titrate. But it would be nice if there were more EMS research of like randomizing people to 2 doses. But if we're in the middle of an epidemic, like a fentanyl epidemic, we most recently had a K2 epidemic, so we have had that sort of cluster, but that's unrelated. But if there's something different going on, then I wouldn't blindly follow this recommendation or this guide, our conclusions, but I would apply them to your situation, your patient, your working environment.
Yeah, that sounds really fair, and I think the onus on us to collect more observations and see where this settles. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I don't want to go beyond our allotted time. Sam, do you folks in Minnesota have any additional comments?
I guess I would have one closing comment on the last article. Mike, thanks for the input, and it sounds like you're taking a reasonable approach to the maybe isolated nature of that particular data. Just to maybe offer a slightly different take on it. It's interesting, the check in an hour and give a turkey sandwich, and if you're okay at that time, you're good. Because that's clearly not the conclusion from the paper. The paper's more have a turkey sandwich immediately and leave without checking in an hour to see if you're good. And additionally, I mean, as I mentioned before, it all depends on the dose of Narcan that you're giving. I would feel comfortable with the turkey sandwich in an hour plan if you gave 0.025 of Narcan and it worked and they're still better in an hour. If you're giving 2 milligrams, though, and you're giving them a turkey sandwich in an hour and sending them home, in the current environment in most metro areas where you can't count on it being heroin, I think that's really bad choice.
All right. Well, I think I think we could do this as a 4-hour seminar. It's a really fascinating topic, and I really appreciate assembling everyone. Minnesota, I want to thank you guys. It was a fabulous job with these articles. Amelia, Abby, Ben, and Sam, great job. I want to thank Tim Erickson, Nick Connors, and Mike Mullins for calling in. Really was a great discussion. Just to put a plug in, on March 21st, ACMT will be having grand rounds. It was moved the time this month, and it'll be Dr. Bala and Emery talking about oximes. The next National Journal Club will be May 9th, and it'll be hosted by our friends in St. Louis, so looking forward to that. Any programs that haven't presented recently, please shoot me an email. We'd love to get you in. And with that, thanks again, Minnesota, and thanks to everyone, and we'll call that a wrap.
Thank you.